So if you've been following all of the reveals and trailers and information for Borderlands 4, one thing has been starting to stick out more and more, and that's the massive tonal shift going from Borderlands 3 to Borderlands 4. And not only is there this massive tonal shift that I think is going much more towards what a lot of the player base has wanted, which is a much more serious tone, but I also think, based upon everything I've seen, the story of Borderlands 4 is just going to be one of the best Borderlands stories so far, at least when it comes to theming. And over the last few months, we've actually gotten quite a lot of information on how the story of Borderlands 4 is going to be going and how it's going to be much more serious, not only from developers and different interviews, but also just from the trailers and gameplay that have been released so far, especially when it comes to the cinematic trailers that we have for 3 of the 4 Vault Hunters, which is where I wanted to start, because these 3 cinematic trailers actually give us a really good idea of a lot of the tone and storytelling going into Borderlands 4. So our first cinematic trailer was Vex, where she's essentially working at a retail store that essentially has like a Black Friday sale where everything goes crazy, people start shooting each other, and that's how she gets her siren powers and ends up basically killing everybody in the entirety of the store, cutting them all in half, including the person that she was flirting with in the store, and that's essentially how she becomes a Vault Hunter. But one of the most interesting parts about how the cinematic trailer is set up, this is the most kind of light-hearted in certain areas and the most comedy infused into one of these cinematics, but I'm not talking about really telling any jokes or anything outwardly comedy based, more so in how absurd the situation is here and making a few like retail store jokes, because you go from her having to deal with this Black Friday sale essentially to basically killing everybody in the room, not knowing how she actually did it, and then basically closing down the store and becoming a Vault Hunter. And I do think this cinematic and all of the cinematics we've gotten so far have been pretty incredible, but this one has kind of the lightest tone, and that's saying quite a bit when the lightest tone is killing like dozens and dozens of people when she gets her siren powers. The second one is Rafa, which is essentially this presentation by TDR where they're showing off their new suits, which are these kind of armored exo suits that these different soldiers are wearing, Rafa being one of them. And while this one does have a few different jokes, this one is a bit more serious than the Vex cinematic, but it also still is kind of pretty absurd in the situation it's in, because it goes from showing these things off in this code-named project for these exosuits, but then turning it into they're actually canceling this because it's too expensive and this is a corporation, so all they care about is profit. So then they start killing off all of these soldiers in the exosuits and just using the exosuits to essentially control these dead people's bodies. So then Rafa has to fight all of them and basically kill everybody on stage to free himself and then go become a Vault Hunter. And I think this was my least favorite out of all of these cinematics, but it's still incredibly cool, has some really cool action scenes, and kind of shows the absurdity of corporations in the Borderlands universe and makes them much less of a joke and much more of these greedy, bloodthirsty corporations that will do anything to just save a few bucks. And the final one, which is the most recent cinematic, is for Eamon. And this one I think has been my favorite so far, even though tonally it's a bit more one note in that I think it's a lot more serious than the other ones, but it's just so cool and has such a good action. Essentially, Eamon is trying to stop a cult from opening up one of the vaults. They end up opening it and a part of like a massive crab boss comes out and starts chomping people, but then Eamon breaks the gate and the crab's claw is cut off, which is probably going to be a boss in the game where we go against this big crab that only has one claw left. And I think the absurdity of this cinematic just comes from how violent this situation gets. It essentially starts with Eamon trying to stop them. Then he basically Hawk smashes some of the enemies together, just turning them into a bunch of blood and mist. Then he uses uses some of his abilities to kill a lot of the other ones, and then at the end, after getting shot in the eye and going a little bit psychotic, he just squishes the main cult member's head and actually turns it into a diamond. But again, this is a much more serious tone. The Eamon cinematic, I think, is the most serious, even though it's still quite absurd. But all of this to say that even in their cinematics that have maybe a bit of comedy and absurd situations that are a bit of a lighter tone, there's still significantly more serious and darker tones than we got in a majority of Borderlands 3. But that's not all the information we have, because we've actually had a bunch of developers talk more about this in different interviews over the past couple months. One of the first things was before Borderlands 4 was really even fully revealed, we had the head writer for Borderlands 4 essentially saying that he doesn't want real world memes in Borderlands 4. I've gone over this in a previous video, but going to Borderlands 3, I think one of the bigger reasons why a lot of people didn't like the story is because a lot of it felt out of the Borderlands universe. It all felt very real world. A bunch of the memes were real world memes. The two main villains were live streamers. So a lot of it just felt like it wasn't in the Borderlands universe. It was taking memes or things from the real world and putting it in Borderlands. In Borderlands 4, multiple developers, including the head writer, have said they really don't want real world memes in Borderlands 4. They want to keep everything specific to Borderlands 4. So even though there's still going to be a good amount of comedy, especially in a lot of the side quests, they want that comedy to be rooted in the Borderlands universe instead of having real world memes in it. Not only that, but Randy Pitchford and a bunch of other developers have straight up said that the tone of Borderlands 4 is much more serious, much darker, and I think even more specifically with the main campaign, the main quest lines, I think that is where a lot of the more serious elements are going to come into play. It does sound like a lot of the side quests are going to have a lot of the more comedy elements built into them, which I think is a decent way to go about it, because Borderlands has always had comedy. It wouldn't make sense for Borderlands to not have a lot of comedy in it, but I do think having that more relegated to a lot of side quests and just have much more sparse comedy in the main campaign is actually going to work a lot better than in previous titles. And another really big element to this is how they're actually managing the development of Borderlands 4, because this was specifically from Randy Pitchford in one of the interviews he did, where he talked about that in Borderlands 3, he gave the team and pretty much everybody on the team almost free reign to just go and make their own quests. And while that's really cool and can create a lot of cool things, what ended up happening in Borderlands 3 is you would have one person or a handful of people making this side quest, a handful of people making another side quest, and they weren't really communicating as much as they should have been. So you would go from one quest to another where it would feel like it was pure comedy, pure real world memes, then going into another quest that was pure comedy, pure real world memes. So it ended up feeling very samey, and just that a lot of the more juvenile humor and real world memes would end up feeling like you were getting way too much of it too frequently. So in Borderlands 4, they're managing it a lot better. So when developing a lot of the quests and side quests, they're taking into account all of the other development of all of the other side quests and things. So it gives you different tones and just mixes up the things you're actually getting when going from quest to quest. So maybe one quest is going to be more comedy, maybe the next one is going to be a bit more serious, then this one could be a bit more comedy as well, but maybe it's a bit more serious comedy or dark humor. So they're just kind of making it flow a lot better and not be so samey where it feels like you're just getting a bunch of like juvenile humor back to back to back. So pretty much everything I have seen for Borderlands 4 tells me that the game is going to be much more serious in general, and the comedy we are going to have is going to be much more rooted in the Borderlands universe instead of being real world memes and real world subjects, which I think is just going to make all of the game better, because that will not only make a lot of the game much more serious, which a lot of people want, but it'll just make the comedy that's actually in the game much better and much more rooted in this universe, which I think is what everybody actually wants. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.